This is the OFN Today on the Our Football Network as we talk Minnesota Vikings football with Chris Thomason. He's the beat writer for the Vikings at the Pioneer Press. That's at twincities.com. Chris joined us before the season began. And Chris, it turned out to be a very disappointing season for Minnesota fans. But a lot happened behind the scenes. That's why I like doing these shows, because if you're not a Minnesota Vikings fan, you don't realize there was just a lot happening especially with injuries. I mean, the injuries, the opt-outs. The Vikings were behind the eight ball from the very beginning of the season, and they weren't really ever able to catch up. So this is going to be a very, very interesting offseason, considering it looks like the team has got some cap issues I'd like to talk to you about. But luckily, they do have 10 picks in the draft.
Yeah, it could be a similar off season to last year with letting some veteran players and salaries go. I mean, last year they had some cap issues and had to shed a lot of veterans, and then they went young, especially on defense. Mike Zimmer, the head coach, said after the season that perhaps they miscalculated things by letting so many veterans go. But this year, they might not have a choice because the cap's going to go down due to the coronavirus pandemic. The minimum will be 175 million. It could be a little bit higher than that, but still it's going to be a drop of 198.2. So basically, they're going to have to shed some veteran salaries and hope they draft well and hope some of the young players from last year mature. But at least they're looking pretty good on offense. They were number 4 in total offense last season, their highest ranking since they were 4th in 2004.
All right, well, let's start there. Let's start with Kirk Cousins. So it seems like these rumors happen every offseason, even though he's only been there 3 seasons. But what's the deal? Is Kirk Cousins definitely the starting quarterback for 2021?
Yeah, I would think so. When they extended his contract last season, last March, it pretty much indicated they'd have totally hitched their wagon to him. He's due $21 million this year, which is already guaranteed, and his $35 million salary for 2022 becomes guaranteed if he's still on the roster on March 19th. So cutting him would just be a massive salary cap hit, and there's nobody. I mean, if they cut him now, they'd have $41 million in dead money next year, and there's no quarterback around waiting in the wings. I mean, sure, there's been trade rumors and what have you, but they still would incur $20 million of dead money, even if they
that's
trade.
a lot. They'd have to get a deal that they couldn't refuse, and I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, nobody, I don't think, I mean, Kirk Cousins did have a good season, but unless somebody's dangling 3 number 1 picks and a bridge quarterback or something like that, I mean, if you could get what the Rams got dealt for Stafford, but I think Stafford is more highly regarded than Cousins is.
Yep. All right. Then what about the quarterback of the future, the 14th overall selection in round 1? Is that a possibility, or do you see that they're really still trying to win now, and the future at quarterback is for another year?
I'd be very surprised if they took a quarterback in the first round, just because they have so many areas they need to shore up, especially in defense. Defensive line, of course, they could use another offensive lineman. The secondary, I mean, Mike Zimmer's fond of saying you can never have too many cornerbacks. They had numerous cornerback issues and injuries last season. And after their first round pick, they don't have a second round pick, so they don't pick again until the 3rd round.
Yep.
So to use a quarterback, and if you're keeping Kirk Cousins, a guy to sit around, I would be very surprised if they took one that early this year. They might try to take one late. I mean, they took Nate Stanley in the 7th round last year. Maybe they take one a little earlier than that this year. But I would think next year, 2021, assuming Kirk Cousins is still on the team and he's heading into potentially his last year of his contract, that might be the year you draft a quarterback high, and then he learns under Cousins, and maybe he takes over in 2023.
Okay. Do they resign Mannion, or does Stanley? Is he? What is the situation right now? Who's going to be the number 2 quarterback?
Well, Manning didn't play at all this past season. He's only played in one game in 2 years with the Vikings, but he plays for the minimum, and they have salary cap issues,
Yeah.
as you discussed. I don't think they're going with. They've got Nate Stanley, who was on the practice squad the whole last year, and they've got Jake Browning, who's been on the practice squad each of the last 2 years. But Mike Zimmer wants a veteran backup. So, they certainly could sign Sean Mannion again if he's willing to take the minimum again. I imagine nobody's going to offer him any more than that, and
Yeah.
or maybe they find some other veteran cheap journeyman. But
Okay.
it's going to
Cousins
be
been durable.
they're going to have a cheap veteran as their number 2 quarterback.
And they should anyway, because that is the one thing about Kirk Cousins. He's been a durable quarterback ever since he's become a full-time starter in this league 6 years ago. I don't even know how many games he's missed, if any.
Yeah, he sat out the last game of 2019 only because they rested starters. Other than that, he's played every single snap for the Vikings in 3 years. He's never had an injury issue. I mean, he's rarely even gotten up slowly, and he's never been on an injury report in which he was like, Kirk Cousins is questionable or something of that nature for a game. Yeah, so that's certainly one thing you can say about him. He's been extremely durable.
All right, now it looked like, and you mentioned he had a good season, and he did. It was his highest career touchdowns, 35. Even though he threw more interceptions than he ever had with 13. His completion percentage was his lowest in his third year with Minnesota, but it's still a pretty good 67%. But I did notice he was 8.3 yards gained per attempt. That's the best of his career since he's been a starter. And that has a lot to do with Justin Jefferson. So, in all, when you rank Cousins and his 3 years, how did you rank 2020?
Well, you can't put it ahead of 2019 only because, he led them to the playoffs into a playoff victory that year. And you've got to look at it as an entire season. He was pretty bad in the first 6 games. They started out 1-5. He threw 10 interceptions, but then he turned it around. His last 10 games, he only threw 3 interceptions to finish with 13, which tied his career high for most. You mentioned his most career touchdown passes, 35. He had the second best passer rating of his NFL career, following only 2019. So, as a whole, you can't call it his best season, but certainly his 10-game stretch to finish the season was among the best that he's ever played over a period of that length.
Dalvin Cook had a phenomenal season. I should know. He was my top fantasy pick. So I enjoyed the year for Dalvin Cook. And there's no reason to think that he's not going to continue to play this way, especially when you take a look at the fact that the offensive line, the tackles had strong seasons. O'Neal really seemed to come into his own. He had a fantastic year. But Dozier, he's a free agent. I can't imagine that the Vikings are interested in bringing him back unless he's a depth guy, because that's definitely a position of upgrade. Ezra Cleveland got some playing time. Bradbury still seems to be more of a run blocker. His pass blocking has not been all that great so far his first couple of years, but he's still only getting ready to play in his third year. So talk a little bit about, the interior. They have to do something about getting a little bit better there, don't they?
Yes, they definitely do. Although they're happy with Ezra Cleveland, he was the rookie last year, second round pick. He moved into the lineup for the second half of the season and was pretty solid at right guard. It all is going to start with what they do with Riley Reif. Overall at left tackle, Reif had a good season, but he took a pay cut, $5 million pay cut at the start of the season, or else he would have been released. His cap number for this year is 13 million plus. He's got a $5 million roster bonus due on the third day of the new league year, so they have to make a decision on him. with their cap issues, with the cap going down, I can't see him coming back at the same number. So I would think they'll try to see if he's willing to come back at a lesser number, a number similar to this past season, because overall he did have a pretty solid season. But if he is steadfast on refusing and he's let go, then you got to start deciding what are you going to do about left tackle. You're going to move Cleveland there. You're going to move Brian O'Neill from right tackle to left tackle. You're going to try to draft a left tackle. So it's kind of a domino effect. You got to figure out who your tackles are, because that affects potentially whether Cleveland's going to be a guard or not. But yeah, they definitely need help at guard regardless, because you mentioned Dozier, one of the lowest rated guards in the NFL this past season. I mean, yeah, maybe they think about bringing him back on the minimum, which he earned this past year as a backup guy. But they probably don't want him to be their starter again this year.
And what about Bradbury? Because when you draft a kid in the first round at center, uh, by this time, you what you want is you want a guy that is on the cusp of being a Pro Bowler. That's what you expect when you take a center in the first round. It just is. It doesn't seem to be there. Do you think he can get there?
He's trending toward being a middle of the pack type center. I mean, going as high as he did, number 18, people are always going to look at that.
Yeah.
Especially since the Saints got Eric McCoy, in the second round, and then he goes and makes the Pro Bowl at center,
Yeah.
which showed there that you don't necessarily have to take a center that high. At this point, I mean, I think he's doing okay. I mean, I'm not going to say they're disappointed with him, but he's trending toward being a middle of the pack type center, and I think they have other problems to worry about on the offensive line now, rather than at this point.
Okay, let's talk about the receivers now. They seem to play a whole load of 12 personnel this year. I haven't been through every team yet, but Smith, Rudolph, and Conklin sure played a lot. So you take a look at the receiver situation, which is extremely strong. It turned out to be just a genius move. It doesn't always work out that way, we know, but the genius move to trade Diggs to get the pick, and it turns into Jefferson, whose stats were better than Diggs the year before. And it's just those things you don't get that lucky or skillful very often, but it's worked out perfectly after 1 year for Spielman and the Vikings. But what about the depth? And because there's still, even though Smith became the number one tight end as far as the receiving goes, he still is not the man I think that they had hoped he would be in that department. Rudolph's getting older. And the number 3 position at wide receiver, even though they don't play it a lot, is still kind of open. I mean, BB's a free agent. He's just a guy. Johnson, actually, his numbers went down in 2020. So what's the deal there at receiver?
Well, I'll start with tight end. Kyle Rudolph recently gave an interview in which he said he's not going to take a pay cut.
Right.
So it all looks like he's probably gone. I mean, he's certainly, with the cap situation and having slipped production wise the last couple of years, he's not going to come back at $7 million a year, $9 million cap number. So let's just assume that if he really is, really won't take a pay cut, then he's gone. I mean, Irv Smith had some injuries last year. He had a groin and he had a back situation which bogged him down, but he was pretty solid at the end of the year. I think that they're confident in him taking over as a number 1 tight end. And Tyler Conklin finished strong. Yeah. He was the number 3 tight end, and I think they probably feel okay about him being the number 2 tight end. And as far as a number 3, they don't play a number 3 tight end that much. So I think they can get by a tight end. But yeah, depth at receiver continues to be an issue. I mean, BC Johnson, his productivity was down, but he did have a very good game against Carolina when Adam Thielen sat out due to being on the COVID-19 reserve list. And he stepped up in that game, and Chad Beebe, he caught the winning touchdown pass in that game and certainly has had some moments. So I think those guys, as long as Thielen and Jefferson stay healthy, I think they feel okay about those guys, but wouldn't be surprised if maybe you try to find a veteran type who might emerge. I mean, they've kind of failed in that degree in recent years, and they brought in Tajay Sharp for $1 million this past year. He didn't catch a single pass, and then got waived with a couple games left in the season. So, yeah, I would think they need some more depth at wide receiver, but again, they probably have more pressing
Yep.
needs than that.
Okay, before we get to defense, let's talk. I don't talk special teams that much unless there's a reason. And there's definitely a reason to talk about the special teams unit for the Vikings, which was really bad this past year. Matter of fact, even before heading into the offseason, looking at their return game, it looked like they needed to get better. Most of the same guys returned, and it just didn't get any better. So it looks like they got to get a little bit more exciting in the return game. But more importantly, they've got to find a reliable kicker. Bailey had that big 2019, and then you kind of felt, oh, okay, wow, maybe he rejuvenated his career in his 10th year. No, it just didn't happen. It was a terrible year for Bailey, especially second half. And Colquitt was a big disappointment after a big year last year. His numbers were down across the board. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on special teams, right?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, I don't think there was a bright spot on special teams the entire year. Maybe a few gunners running down on punt returns and having some good tackles, but it was a disaster all the way around. I mean, Bailey and Colquitt both possibly won't be back. They don't have guaranteed monies left in their contract. You would owe them dead money due to their signing bonuses. But the question there, I think, only there's definitely going to be competition. Will they just cut those guys outright and bring in some new guys, or will they bring in some new guys and then kind of have a challenge and that sort of thing? And if there's a tie, then you go with the lower paid guy,
Yeah.
obviously.
Okay.
But yeah, so that I wouldn't be surprised if both the punter and the kicker are gone. The return game has been a disaster the last few years. They took KJ Osborne in the fifth round to be the returner. He didn't pan out. Chad Beebe ended up doing it, but he was nothing special. Amir Abdullah has been handling the kickoff returns the last few years and has been nothing special at all. I mean, and it was only, when Zimmer first arrived, they had perhaps the best combo kick returner or punt returner in the NFL with Cordero Patterson and Marcus Sherrills. So that has completely changed. So they need to completely and totally revamp their special teams, which is exactly why the special teams coordinator, Marwan Malouf, was not retained. And they just the other day promoted Ryan Ficken, who was the assistant last year. He has the job now.
All right, let's turn to the defense now. And this is where things really get interesting, especially on the defensive line, because Michael Pierce was the top free agent signed in the offseason. He opts out after getting a 3-year deal. A defensive tackle from Baltimore, that was going to be important. So he'll hopefully, of course, be a big boost. Daniel Hunter, the elite pass rusher who led the team with 14 and a half sacks last year, he had neck surgery. He didn't play. Then of course, you lost Griffin, who added 8 sacks to free agency. Ngakoue was brought in, gave up a second-round pick to the Jaguars. That didn't work out at the point where the record wasn't good. I'm assuming that's the reason he decided, let's trade him. You can confirm that. And what's interesting is he was leading and still ended up as the sack leader for the team. He played 6 games, and he led the team with 5 sacks. That shows you how many issues the Vikings had at rushing the passer last year. Then they traded Ngakoue to Baltimore for a 3rd-round pick. And Barr also, if you're talking about the linebackers, let's throw that in the front 7. He tore his pec muscle week 2 against Indy. He was done for the year. And now you've got free agents, including Odenigbo, who was the best edge rusher on the team. He led the team with 15 quarterback hits. He's got 10 and a half sacks and 28 quarterback hits in his first 2 years with the team. So now they got to resign him. And they also have Eric Wilson and Julio Johnson as free agents. So a lot to digest there.
Yeah, let's start with the defensive line. Yeah, it was pretty much a disaster last year. I mean, they're hoping that Pierce can come in. I mean, Mike Zimmer teams, he's always wanted that nose tackle, run stopper guy, and he wasn't there last year. So teams were just running right up the middle with Linville Joseph gone. And they had released Linville Joseph in a salary cap related move. He refused to take a pay cut, but when they did that, they knew pretty much they were going to get Pierce. So they probably wouldn't have done that if they knew they weren't going to get Pierce. And then, of course, but at the time, they could not have expected him to opt out due to the coronavirus. So they're hoping that he can step in and stabilize that spot. They still need a three technique guy. I mean, Julio Johnson was not the answer last year. He's a free agent. Might be surprising if he returns. Shamar Steffen previously played that spot. He was the nose tackle this past year, did nothing special. He's got, a somewhat hefty contract. Maybe he sticks around and is a candidate at three technique, or maybe they just release him. There's no doubt that they will draft a defensive line high or several of them. At defensive end, I mean, obviously they're hoping Daniil Hunter returns to his previous form, but neck surgery we'll always have to see. Everyone I've talked to indicates he should be able to return to his old form, but they won't know until they see him on the field. Odenigbo, I mean, basically he had kind of a breakout season in 2019, but took a step back last year, and I think the reason he did so well in 2019 is a lot of times they stuck him inside on pass rushing situations, and you had Hunter on one side and Griffin on the other, and so he got all these sacks with teams focusing on him. Without Hunter and Griffin on the field this year, Odenigbo was nothing special. I mean, he certainly could return being a restricted free agent, but they're not going to break the bank.
Okay, so he's
for
restricted.
Him.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, they've got DJ Wanham, who they liked his progress last year. I don't know if he's quite ready yet to be a starter. So they'll probably look for another defensive end. There's no doubt to potentially start alongside Hunter, but if not, the options would be Wanham or Odenigbo again if he's comes back at a reasonable price tag. I mean, I could see him just coming back for the tender. I don't think anybody's going to throw down a lot of money on him. And moving to linebacker, the most interesting question there is Anthony Barr and Eric Wilson. So basically, Anthony Barr has a $15 million cap number. He's due $12 million or so base salary. He's coming off pectoral surgery, and it might be real tough for him to return under that cap number. So wouldn't be surprised if they go to him and see if he's willing to restructure his contract. And if he says no dice, I mean, it's not out of the realm that he could be cut. But basically, Barr or Wilson, there's no way that both will be back. Wilson's unrestricted. I was talking to one person a month or two ago. They thought that he might be able to command $9-10 million a year with the cap. With the cap the way it is, that might be
too much.
A little high. But they only play two linebackers every snap, and the third linebacker only plays 25% of the plays because they're in the nickel. So Eric Hendricks is one linebacker, and then the other one will either be Barr or Wilson. I mean, if Barr comes back, Wilson won't be re-signed, and if Barr is let go, then I'm sure they'll make an effort to bring back Wilson.
Okay. Now let's go into the secondary, as you said. I mean, this is Zimmer's pet project every year, and things looked good a few years ago. And then, of course, in the offseason, they lost Rhodes and Waynes and Alexander. So two of their top outside corners were gone. And there was a lot of, we talked about this in the preseason, a lot of angst and fingers crossed that some of these young kids would hold their own. Dantzler seemed to play well. I was, from what I saw, it looked like Dantzler had a really good rookie season. Gladney had a typical rookie season for a rookie. I think he played the most snaps, and he had a lot of ups and downs, mostly downs, but he's a rookie. And then Mike Hughes, the slot guy, he's just been an injury-prone player. I'm not sure what the Vikings are going to do with him. And then there were a few other injuries there as well. But at cornerback, it looks like that's definitely going to be a primary position in the offseason, correct?
Yeah, there's no doubt there. I mean, you're right about Danzler, although he did miss 5 games due to injury, and the Vikings say that he needs to gain strength and gain muscle because they need him to be more available. So I think definitely he's one of your starting cornerbacks next season. Gladney, yeah, he had his ups and downs, and he might be a better nickelback moving forward rather than an outside corner. So I wouldn't be surprised if they look for an outside corner type guy to potentially for the future, and Gladney being the nickel
Yeah.
guy. As far as Hughes, I mean, he's been hurt all the time. Obviously, they're not going to pick his 5th year option up. He's entering his 4th year. They won't pick his 5th year option up. So, I mean, there's probably no point in this now to just cut him. I mean, bring him back after his neck injury, see what he looks like. And I mean, it would be a contract year for him. So, if he can stay healthy, he could play himself into the mix for being a long term guy. But they still need more long-term guys at cornerback. I mean, they brought in some stopgap guys. Chris Jones came in. They picked him up. Harrison, excuse me, Harrison Hand was a rookie. He showed a few things, so he could be a depth guy moving forward. But yeah, they definitely need additional depth at cornerback.
Okay, and then nothing to worry about at safety though, because I mean it was like Anthony Harris and Harrison Smith, but those are the only two guys at safety that played all year. They didn't have the numbers from the year before, but you can understand why. With the young corners and the issues up front, they weren't going to put up big numbers again like they did in 2019. But Anthony Harris is the big free agent, and is that mean he's gone?
I would think so. I mean, he played under the franchise tag of 11 million plus this past season. The Vikings didn't want to give him a long term deal, which he wanted because they wanted to see more. I mean, he had a real good season in 2019, was ranked number 1 safety in the NFL by Pro Football Focus, tied for the NFL lead with 6 interceptions. But they wanted to see more. I mean, it was his first year as a regular full time starter the whole year. And quite frankly, he did not deliver this past season. I mean, granted, there were a lot of other young players on defense, so there's certainly no chance that they're going to franchise tag him, which would be 13 million. And I don't see how they could even bring him back at his current salary. I mean, if he's willing to take a pay cut for a longer term deal, but that's a lot to ask of
Yeah.
people. So might be a surprise if he returns. You've got Harrison Smith, who's got 1 year left in his contract, but still playing at a high level. I mean, he might be the type of guy that they might try to lock up to an extension a few more years, and maybe that can help adjust the
Yeah.
cap number 2 for 2021. But the bottom line is, yeah, they definitely need. I mean, they've been fortunate in recent years that the safeties have played basically every snap of every game. And Harrison Smith got thrown out of a game against Houston in week 4, late in the first half. And they had just signed George Iloka, and he came in, and I mean, he wasn't great, but it would have been a disaster if they didn't have him. So they definitely need some depth at safety, and definitely probably need another starter alongside Harrison Smith. And plenty of fans here keep saying, well, why in the heck didn't they draft Antoine Winfield
Yeah.
Jr. instead of Gladney with that particular pick? And of course, Winfield's heading for a Super
Yeah.
Bowl now with Tampa Bay.
And look, I can understand that, but overall, and we'll close with this department, the front office, and the coaching staff, and that is that really Chris Spielman has done a fine job from my perspective. How
Rick Spielman.
Rick Spielman? I mean, yeah, Rick Spielman. I was thinking I just did a Detroit Lions show. Yeah, so Rick Spielman. So tell me a little. Do you agree with that? That Rick Spielman has been a pretty good talent evaluator, and there's no reason to think that he ain't going to be around for a while.
Well, both he and Mike Zimmer signed extensions, 3-year extensions, right before this past season. So both are now under contract for the next 3 years. But you got to say that both are on the hot seat. I mean, certainly Mike Zimmer is after missing the playoffs. I mean, since he came, it's since 2014, they've missed it, made it, missed it, made it, missed it, made it. I mean, that's been they haven't made the playoffs 2 straight years, the Vikings, since 2008,
And they
2009.
haven't.
So
Okay, all
I
right,
would
and
I would think
give it one more year
for
to make it.
Zimmer, yeah, I would if they don't make the playoffs in 2021, I would be surprised if Zimmer's still around in 2022. As far as Rick Spielman, I mean, he's definitely done a solid job drafting overall. I mean, you've got to look at
Yeah,
that, but but the bottom line is some of their contracts they've handed
true.
out haven't panned out. Obviously, they've given Kirk Cousins huge money, but in 3 years they made the playoffs once under Kirk Cousins, and that's restricted their ability to sign other players. And they haven't really built on 2017 when they made it to the NFC Championship game. They had the number one ranked defense in the NFL in scoring and total defense, and then they get Kirk Cousins, and everybody's thinking, okay, he's the final piece, and they go 8-7
Yeah.
and 1. So really, they've since 2017 they've been barely over 500 as a franchise. So I think Spielman will be evaluated a little bit differently than Zimmer because you'll look at some of his draft picks, especially his most recent ones, and how they are doing in their second season and that sort of thing. But if it's a non-playoff season, I mean, there's no
Sure.
guarantee that Spielman's back in 22.
Okay, and what's the situation with the offensive coordinator job? What's going on there?
They're doing some interviews and what have you, but most observers believe that Clint Kubiak, the son of Gary Kubiak, who was the quarterback's coach, is the most likely one to take
Okay.
over. They also have in-house offensive line coach, run game coordinator Rick Dennison, who has like 10 years of experience as an NFL offensive coordinator. So I think they'll stay in-house. I mean, all the coordinator, every time Zimmer's gone, or at least the two occasions he's gone outside to bring in a coordinator, has been a disaster. I mean, he brought in John DeFilippo in 2018 as offensive coordinator. He was fired with 3 games left in the season. He brought in Marwin Malouf from the outside, and he lasted 2 seasons in the special teams, especially last year or 2020 were a disaster. So I don't think Zimmer, especially with his job security, maybe a little uneven, is going to want to bring in anybody from the outside to be a coordinator. They went in house for special teams, and I expect them to go in house for offensive coordinator.
And lastly, Stefanski. How do the fans, oh, they feel good about Stefanski. He was one of our guys. Or are they like, well, wait a second, maybe he should have been our head coach? Bottom line is that Stefanski did an incredible job with Cleveland. Were you surprised?
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised. I mean, he's not a guy who was a long-time coordinator. I mean, he had one full season as a coordinator, and he had Gary Kubiak to help him through that season as offensive advisor. So, I mean, when he was hired, the jury was out, and so far it's looking pretty good. So I've got to admit, I'm a little surprised at how great the Browns did under him. So that's all the power to him. That's good, and we'll see how they do next year. As far as Stefanski, I mean, yeah, you hear rumblings like, yeah, we should have kept him as and been the head coach. But I mean, the Vikings in 2019 did win a tough playoff
Yeah.
game at New Orleans, and you're thinking after that season, you didn't know they were going to let all these veterans go. I mean, you knew that with the cap they were going to let some go, but you didn't know it was going to be such a mass exodus. So you're thinking they would have built upon that season. I mean, let's just say they just had the same season and Stefanski is ready to go to Cleveland. Who knows? Maybe then they pull the trigger and he's the Vikings coach. But I mean, there certainly was no chance in 2019 that the Vikings were going to let go of Zimmer then and replace him with Stefanski, especially after they win the big playoff game in New Orleans that year.
All right, just want to remind everybody, if you enjoy this video, you can subscribe. Obviously, if you're watching on YouTube, you could also like the video, and you'll be able to get more of these. We're going to send out not only this video out on social media, but we're going to break down clips. So we're going to give everybody an opportunity to check out this show and many others coming down the road this offseason here on the Artlands Football Network. Matter of fact, we're going to talk Baltimore Ravens football and San Francisco 49ers football in the next couple of days. Chris, it's going to be a really interesting offseason for the Vikings, and I look forward to getting an opportunity to talk to you again sometime in between free agency and the draft, because as you were saying on the show, there's just so many interesting details that need and issues that need to be clarified regarding contracts and so forth. That once we find out what the Vikings are left with after free agency, we'll have a much better indication of what they're going to do for the draft. And hopefully we'll be able to talk to you again once we get closer to the draft. And that's going to be a big deal for Vikings fans because they've had a long season. And I think they need something to feel good about.
Okay, you got it.
Thanks, Chris. We'll talk to you next time.
All right, really appreciate it, Greg.
You got
Thanks.
it.